Adobe Illustrator creates what are called vector graphics. Vector graphics are based on math, not pixels, which means you can take something like this and you can resize it and modify it, and they will always stay and keep their shape the same way. Now, if you're creating a new document, you've got to go into File, New, and you're going to get this dialog box. Depending on what you've last worked on, it will give you some options. If you don't see options up here, then go to Print, and then you can choose what you want to work on. Mostly we work on letter-sized documents, and I'm going to choose a landscape for orientation. Let's click on Create. So now I have a new blank document. The other thing you want to do is up here at the top of the toolbar, you want to go to this little flyout here where it says Switch Workspace and click to Essentials Classic. That gives you a few more settings and tools so that you see right in front of you all the changes and things that you can make. Now, for this assignment, you're going to work with your name and with text. So there's two kinds of text in Illustrator. One is paragraph text, and which is just when you drag open. And what that does is when you select the text box, you can resize it and it reformats, which is great if you're making stories because you can take text and you can flow it into another box and so on. But that's not the kind of text that you want to use for this assignment. You want to use what's called creative text, and that works by clicking on the text and just click on the screen, and then you can type your name in this case. So I'm just going to select that and make that bigger because I'm going to work with that. I can drag it bigger, and I'm going to hold down my Alt key, and I'm going to make 4 copies because I'm going to need a few different copies of that. Now, if you have your text box, then you go to your text tool here, and then you can select individual letters. You can change their color. Up here, you can change their size by playing with the font sizes, and so you can play around with font sizes in here, and you can also change what font you're actually using by choosing that in here. So you can modify each one to be individual, right? So that's the basic part. You can also rotate and distort the text. So if you go in here, there you have rotation tools and other transformation tools. So I can flip, rotate and flip, and I can go into the one below, which is scale and shear and reshape tools. So if I go to the shear tool and I drag, I can actually do quite a bit of change to my name just by dragging and dropping. So very handy. Okay, so that's one part. The next part I want you to do is I want you to create a shadow and some 3D. Now you can put a shadow on a 3D object, but you can't put 3D on a shadow. So I'm going to start with the shadow first. So I'm going to go Stylize, Drop Shadow, and I go in here and I get a dialog box where I can choose the color of my shadow. So I can choose a different color if I want and say OK, and I can choose how big it is and how far off to one direction or another it is. That's called the offset, right? So I can preview that and say OK. So that's my drop shadow. And for 3D, I go into Effect, Stylize again, and I go into 3D. And I go Extrude and Bevel is what we want to work with. So if I go in here, again, it gives us a preview. See, now that's what I'm talking about. If you try to put 3D on a shadow, it does not work, right? You get a box. So what you want to do is you want to take your name and go Effect. And for this to work really well, you actually want to give your text a outline color. So that's the second box here. So I'm going to give it a red outline. And now I'm going to go into Effect, 3D, and Extrude and Bevel. So now if I look at my preview, you can see how that works. And I can actually pick up this box and it will give me a preview. And I can change how deep it is by playing with the flyout here. And whoops, that's really deep, so it's almost too much. So I can play with that. And under the extra settings down here, I can actually control where the lighting is coming from and how the shading is going to work and all that. So that will change the appearance of that. So that's the 3D part of things. Okay, I'll put that to the side. Now, I also want you to be able to put text on a path. So for that, though, you need a path first. So I'm going to take my pencil tool and I'm going to make a path. So I have this path here. Now if I go to my text tool and hold it down, you notice that any tool that has a little triangle has more choices. So in this case, I hold down my text tool and I can type on Path tool. So now if I hover over this, I can actually click on it and then I can type on the path directly. And again, I can change the size of the font and do whatever changes I want with that, right? So I've got to go back, and if I want to make changes, now I have to switch back to my regular type tool. So I have to go away from the type on path tool and go back to my standard text tool to be able to make modifications on that. So if I hold that down, go back to type tool, so I can select that and change that to a different case letter, for example. right? Okay, that's type on path. Now, if you want to modify a shape, so I'm going to move that. If I take that and I want to distort it, do something artistic to it, there's a whole bunch of tools in here that you can play with. So under the sharing, there are distortion tools, and here's a width tool, twirl tool, and so on. So if we go to the twirl tool and I try to use that, you notice I get a pop-up box. And in Illustrator, you want to read those pop-up boxes because they tell you why a tool isn't working. So it says it must contain, or it contains text which must be converted to outlines. So, okay, I need to do that first. So if you right-click on it and then go create outlines, bang, now you have outlines. You notice that now you have all these little dots which are called nodes, and now that will modify. If I pull on that, it will twirl, and I can pick different tools and get different effects. Right? So again, that's the twirl tool, but I can use a scallop tool, and I can keep making changes to that. If you make too many changes, you won't be able to recognize what you started with, but sometimes that's not a bad thing, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. This also works with any kind of other object. So if I go into my shape tool and I pick a star, and I drag a star open, and I want to modify that, again, I can click on that, and now I can move that around. So if I go to my selection tool, you notice that there's extra points. So if I pull on these points, it modifies the shape, and it changes the entire thing. But if I click off the object and hover over it, I can then pick up individual nodes and modify the way that my shape is coming together. And that works for this, and it also works for our letters, right? So that's our modifying shapes by distorting it by using the nodes or the anchors. We also have the ability to combine shapes. So if we have, let's say, a star, so I'll go back to my shapes tool, and I'll make the star, and I'll change the color of it, and I'll make it green, and I'll hold this down, and I will go to a polygon, and this time I want to control over what the polygon looks like. So I'm going to click, and I would say, okay, I actually want a 4 point. So by clicking rather than dragging it open, it gives you the dialog box. So now I've got my 4-box-sided polygon, which is just a square, and I'm going to give that a different color. I'm going to layer that and move that over there in a second. And I'm going to do one more. I'm going to do a ellipse, and I'm going to pull that open, and I'm going to change the color of that just so you can see what happens. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my black pointer tool, and I'm going to layer these so that they're together so you can see what happens. So as I select all three together, then I can actually have them combine or subtract and so on, and that's called the Pathfinder tool. So I go under Effect, Pathfinder, and then I have all of these options here. So if I go Add, and so now it gives me a warning box that this has to be grouped first. So what I do, right click, and I make a group. So now I can go Effect, Pathfinder, and I can go to Add, and now it makes it all into one shape. Now if I want to change that shape, I could go back and redo it, or I can go Effect, Pathfinder, and I can try to do something else, but it's not going to give me anything in here because it's all one object now. If you go to on the side on this panel to this Effects panel, under Appearance, it actually shows you what you've done to this. So it says here, Add. That's our effect. If I double click on that, I get my Pathfinder dialog box, and then I can actually see what it would exclude look like, what would divide look like, what would a hard mix look like, what would a soft mix look like, and so on, so that you can actually see the different blending modes that you can apply to the object. So I want you to make a few different ones to show me that you've tried a few of the different modes. Okay, and then I also want to show you a couple more tools. So I'm going to start with a rectangle here. I want to show you the difference between the eraser tool and the knife tool. So if we go into the eraser tool, then we want to go in here, and that's our pencil tool. We want to go in here, eyedropper, eraser tool. So the eraser tool is like a paintbrush, and I can change how big it is and the settings for it. So I can change the properties up here. If I go with my eraser tool, it actually takes away pieces out of my design. If I go down and I use my knife tool instead, so if I go down here, that's a reflect and rotate tool, and I can shear tool, and I want to get to my knife tool. Yeah, same place as the eraser, but just below the knife tool is different in the sense that if I go through my object, it's made a line through, and if I click off the object and then go back on, I can actually pull it together, but this is a perfect fit. right? So I can make puzzle pieces that fit together. That's not the case here. This part is really gone. You're not going to be able to fit that back in. So that's the difference between using an eraser and using a knife tool. Okay. Now, we also can blend shapes and together. So I'm going to show you how that works. So we'll start with a rounded rectangle tool. So we'll start with that. And we'll also take a star tool, let's say. So go in here, and I'm going to use a star, pull that open. I'm going to change the color of that. Okay, so now I have two objects, and I'm going to go into my tool here, into my blend tool. And with that blend tool, if I actually double click on it, then I can see how I want it to go. So I want it in specified steps, and let's say I'll make it in 8 steps. And say OK. So now if I click on my first shape and then click on my second shape, it has done the transition from one to the other in 8 steps and blended the colors as well. So that's the blending tool. You can also blend colors rather than blending shapes. So if I start with a star tool again, I'll pull that open, and I want to put a gradient on that, I go to my gradient tool and I can click on my object. So it gives me a black and white gradient, which isn't terribly beautiful, but I can click on those points and then choose other colors for the beginning and end points. And let's pick something a little different. And I can also click on the line itself, and I can add more points. So then it picks the color that's currently there, but I can pick a different color in there. And these little white markers are the midpoints on my gradient. So I can actually pull that so I can see what my gradient looks like. Okay, at very last but not least, I want to show you how to put an object into another shape. So I have my letters here, and this works with letters. It works with any other shape. You just need to have the shape that you want to be the container on the top. So right now it's behind this object, so I have it selected, and I can go Object, Object, Arrange, and Bring to Front. So now it's in the front. And now if I select the two together, the background image as well as my name, and I can right-click on it and say Make Clipping Mask, and now it's put that inside the actual shape here. So, and if I want to modify it, I can double-click on it, and then I'm inside, and I can move this around, and you can see how it fills the lettering inside that shape. So you get an idea of how that works. And that works with photos as well as with other objects. Okay, so if on my desktop I have a large image of a flower, I'm going to bring that in here, and I'm going to change the size. It's very, very big up here, so I'm going to make that much smaller. So I'm going to make that 300 pixels by 200 pixels. That way you can control it rather than having to drag a lot. You can just do it this way. So I get that image. I'm going to put that where my name is, and I'm going to go out. So I have my image, and I'm going to right click and say Release Clipping Mask. So now I have my name again. In this case, I have my name, and again I want it to the front. So I go Object, Object, Arrange, Bring to Front, and now put that. Oops, did not like that. And here, I'm going to go Object, Arrange, Bring to Back, Send to Back. You can do that as well. So now if I select the two together, right click and say Make Clipping Mask, I can put the photo inside of it. So those are all the steps that I want you to do for the Illustrator assignment starting up. Next, you will make a map.